Thank you so much for joining us for the May Autism Parenting Summit. My name is Sharon Longo, and I'll be your host for this session titled The ABCs of Learning, Attention, Balance, and Coordination. We're thrilled to have an expert who brings both professional insight and personal experience to this important topic. Sally Blythe is an author and consultant in neurodevelopmental education and the former director of the Institute for Neuro-Physiological Psychology, INPP, where she developed the INPP screening test for use in schools in the UK. So please join me in welcoming Sally Blythe. First of all, welcome. And the first question that I have is, can you explain the concept of attention, balance, and coordination, the ABC, and its significance in the learning process for children, particularly those on the autism spectrum?
I always use that sort of analogy of ABC to try to explain what the three key factors I think are for learning readiness, for being ready for school, irrespective of whether they're on the autistic spectrum or not. So when I talk about attention, I mean the ability to focus attention on one task without being continuously distracted either by external stimuli or by internal stimuli. It could be one or both. Then balance, because it's essential for control of posture, for being able to sit and stay still, and is a physical precursor to being able to maintain attention. Because if balance is working well, the other sensory systems are likely to be better integrated, and therefore they're going to be less easily distracted by lots of other things. And then coordination, because balance is necessary for coordination. Without coordination, we can't control the hands and the eyes to write. We can't control the eye movements to be able to read easily. And so those three things are like the physical foundations for later learning success.
Right. So then what about vestibular and proprioceptive development? Can you explain that in simple terms?
When I looked at these questions, these are huge, huge things to describe. So I'll see what I can do. So balance mechanism is located in the inner ear on both sides. And it is basically our primary detector of motion and position in space. So it's the thing that tells us where we are in space and guides how we respond to anything that's happening either within ourselves in terms of motion or the environment. And I think an indication of how important it is that it develops so early in life, so that it's in place at 8 weeks after conception. It's functioning at 16 weeks. And it's the only one of the sensory systems to be fully, in neurological terms, sort of wired up or prepared to be wired up by the time of birth. But it's no good simply having a balance mechanism. You've got to learn how to use it. And those first weeks, months, and years of life are crucial in not only working the balance system, but teaching it how to work in relation to the other sensory systems and to direct the adaptation of muscle tone to different environments. So balance really supports everything that we do in a gravity-based environment. And its development continues from infancy right through to sort of old age. And it's not something we have, it's something we do. And my late husband always used to use the analogy of giving a child a grand piano at birth. And it may look beautiful and it may be something lovely to have in your living room, but unless it learns to practice it and to play it, it's a silent instrument. And in that sense, the balance mechanism needs to be used and it needs to be practiced. And its primary teacher is movement experience and movement opportunity. With the first year of life being the foundation again, in as far as the infant goes from being this small, helpless creature that needs its head supported, needs its body supported, to hopefully within about a 12-month period being able to stand and walk. And in that time, it's got to learn how to use that mechanism in relation to muscle tone to support posture, balance, and coordination. So that's the sort of vestibular part. Now, let me remind myself the proprioceptive part. So the proprioception describes, in general terms, the feedback the brain receives from relative tension in the muscles, spindles, and joints. So when we are in a stationary position doing nothing, there's not a lot of deep proprioceptive input. But as soon as we move something, like our wrist backwards and forwards, that motion alters the relative tension in the muscle spindles and joints and starts to tell the brain where the hand is, where the arm is, the amount of movement, the amount of force, and so on. So movement experience is the major entrainer of proprioceptive awareness, of the brain starting to know where different parts of the body are in space without relying on the external sensory systems of things like vision and hearing to support it. So even if we close our eyes, I should still know where my wrist is. And if I'm not sure, if I wiggle it about, I start to be more confident about where it is in space. So both of those systems are described as interoceptor systems, which means that we feel them through internal sensation. Unlike things like vision and hearing, where we use them to process information that's outside of ourselves. So these are the sort of internal dynamics of knowing our body from the inside. And in infancy, proprioceptive awareness is built through activities like tummy time, lifting the head, grasping an object, mouthing an object, reaching for an object, kicking the legs in space, crawling, walking, and the more weight bearing there is, the deeper that proprioceptive input to the brain is as well. So that continues through childhood, and activities that involve resistance, with pushing, pulling, lifting, climbing, digging, all those sorts of things are really good proprioceptive trainers. And they go right on to the end of life. And we see the system deteriorating at the end of life in reverse, if you like. So, for example, if you have rheumatoid arthritis or some sort of skeletal damage as you get older, so the proprioceptive input gets weaker. Equally, if perhaps you've been unlucky enough to have chemotherapy and you've developed a degree of, what's it called? Gosh, it's gone for a moment. When you lose the sensation from the nerves coming back to the neuropathy, that's the one. You develop a degree of neuropathy. Sometimes the symptoms that you see in an elderly person look as if they have a problem with motor planning. So, for example, you might see someone approaching a step that they've got to go down, and they keep trying the foot over the space as if they're not quite sure how to do it. Actually, the motor planning problem is secondary to the fact that the information is not coming up from the base of the body as a result of the neuropathy to tell the brain where the foot, the ankle, the knee is. And so the thinking part of the brain knows what it wants to do, but it can't work out how because the proprioceptive information is poor. So if we don't want to be like that throughout our lives, potentially we need to have lots of proprioceptive training opportunity in those first months and years of life to prime that system together with the vestibular system to support balance and coordination.
So then things like tummy time, for a baby, that is going to sort of gear them up for the rest of their lives.
Yes, because it not only it's the lifting of the head and the pushing up and the learning how to do something, but you get a lot of tactile information from being supported by the ground, by moving your limbs in a different position on the ground. And this is the beginning of knowing where I am in space physically. So yes, tummy time, but on the back as well, it's the opportunity to lie there and have free space for movement, practice and experience, as random as possible, really. And that's also a cognitive learning skill. When a baby learns to hold its head up for the first time, when it learns how to roll over, how to get from lying to sitting, that's not just a physical puzzle that it's solved. It's had to go through a cognitive process as well as it learns how to do something, often by accident, and then thinks, how do I repeat that? What have I just done?
Yeah, I mean, you don't necessarily think of it as, we see a baby just laying there, kind of batting their hands, but we don't think how important every one of those steps is.
Yes, yes.
So then what practical strategies can parents and teachers implement to support vestibular and proprioceptive development at home and in the classroom?
Oh, I think it's understanding what the vestibular system responds to. So it detects a very small range of things. It detects turning movements of the head, flexion and extension movements of the head, tilting of the head or the body or the environment, or when movement starts, stops, or changes speed or direction. So you don't have to give a lot of deep, rapid stimulation to actually provide training. And this is something that's quite often misunderstood. People think, oh, well, if I've got to try and improve their balance, I've got to do lots and lots of rapid spinning. Well, you'll make them dizzy very quickly, but you won't necessarily train the system better than if you've given a little bit of motion and then stopped and allowed that mechanism to stabilize, recalibrate, and then you move again. So it's thinking what sort of activities stimulate different parts of the vestibular system. So things that involve rotation, and that doesn't necessarily have to be spinning of the self like this. It can be things like traditional country dances or folk dances where they're doing lots of circle time and they're doing it in different directions, where they're having to go into the center of the circle and then turn and face a partner and come back again. Things like swings that provide for stimulation for the forward and backward part, and then things that will involve tilting. So it's trying to bring activities that involve those different planes of movement. And if you have a child who is super sensitive to one of them, then you need to tone down the stimulation to the point that's tolerable for them and then build it up gradually.
Right, right. So if a child, let's say, gets motion sickness, swinging back and forth, and do it in a more gentle way, or
Also, even to start off with gentle head movements up and down, so that the balance mechanism is getting used to a forwards and backwards motion. And then, as you say, perhaps start a very small swinging movement. And only when they're getting over that would you start to increase it and make it more vigorous.
Right, right. So how can enhancing vestibular and proprioceptive skills improve classroom readiness and stamina in children?
I think it's understanding again that that vestibular proprioceptive relationship is crucial for control of posture and static balance. So when we have good posture, we are able to maintain stillness. And children who are in constant motion or seem to need constant motion may be telling us something very important about that vestibular function, that it's not yet well enough calibrated to be able to maintain that stillness. I always love the sort of idiosyncrasies of the English language and the word poise. And somebody who is extremely poised is somebody who is able to maintain stillness through between one phase of movement and another, unlike the person who's got to be all over the place. And so for a child to have poise, which in some ways is the physical correlate of the beginning of being able to maintain attention, they need to have balanced proprioceptive systems working well to support posture. And I think it was beautifully described by the late Ray Barsh, who wrote some wonderful books on motor perceptual efficiency in the 1960s, when he described the young child as a terranaut, an astronaut who is an explorer on terra firma. And he said the most important task a child has in that first year of life is to become master or mistress of his or her own body in space, to become competent and confident in the use of space. then they will be able to sit still, to carry out coordinated activities, and to be the child who sits there as teacher's pet and looks perfect in the classroom.
Right.
So there's that. And then the fact that posture provides a reference point for centers involved in the control of eye movements that are going to be needed for reading, writing, and copying. And that the sense of physical body stability also supports our sense of emotional security. The late Jean Ayres talked about gravitational security, of having that physical security in space. But if for any reason we feel physically insecure, our ability to process external sensory information becomes impaired, levels of arousal go up, and the ability to cognitively process that information starts to deteriorate. And then again, the excitation and arousal levels go up once more. So physical stability is an important precursor to feeling emotionally secure, irrespective of the things going on socially and emotionally in a child's life.
Right. The word grounded popped into my head. If you're
Yes.
grounded, you're, feeling okay in, emotionally and, in a lot of different ways. So,
Yes.
yeah. Now, you've done a lot of extensive work and research on retained primitive reflexes. So can these retained reflexes affect a child's attention, their balance, their coordination, and also what about handwriting and self-regulation?
Okay. So certain of those early reflexes respond or react instantaneously to vestibular stimulation. So for example, if the head is turned to one side and the baby inside the womb is like this, and about a third of the way through pregnancy, a reflex develops, which means when the head turns to one side, the arm and leg on that side try to extend in this restricted space. And when the head comes back to the center, the arm and leg comes back with it. Same thing to the other side. That should be fully active at the time of birth because it has several functions to fulfill, but it shouldn't still be active when a child starts formal schooling. Or it means when they try to write, as long as the head's in the midline, no problem. But if they start turning the head to follow visually what the hand is doing, that's what the hand would really like to do. It wants to extend and the fingers want to open. So this child's got to find a way of controlling this. And there's all sorts of ways of doing it. Maybe the way they hold a pen or pencil, how tightly they hold it, the angle they sit at so that they can write with a straight arm. But it means the mechanical action of writing never becomes an automatic one. If the head is turned to one side, the hand starts to have a will of its own. So what we often see is children who are highly intelligent, they are verbally very articulate, but when they write something, it doesn't reflect in any way what you know that they are actually capable of, because the physical action of writing affects the ability to transfer information from here onto paper and can even interfere with the ability to think coherently once there is an additional physical task involved. So that's one example. And the other that may be particularly important for children on the autistic spectrum is the moro reflex and its relationship to vestibular functioning. So every parent will remember what a moro reflex looks like in their child. If you handle a newborn baby unexpectedly, there's a sudden loud noise, there's a sudden change in light, the baby will and start screaming, which is exactly what it needs to do. It's its basic fight, flight, panic alarm reflex before it has the muscle tone or the other skills available to protect itself. But somewhere around 4 months of age, that starts to be transformed into what's called an adult startle response. So something unexpected happens, the baby blinks, shrugs its shoulders, and starts to use its senses to search the environment and make a thinking decision. Do I need to react to that, or can I ignore it and carry on with what I was doing? If you still have that moral reaction, you don't have the luxury of those few seconds of thinking about it. You react first, and 2 seconds later, the thinking brain comes in and says, why did I just do that? It wasn't anything to be really scared of. because that reflex is our basic panic alarm reflex, the hormones associated with fight and flight have already been secreted into the system. So you had the reaction, you feel as if the threat was real, even though everything and everybody around you says it was nothing to be scared of. So you get a discrepancy between what you know and what you feel. You don't know when it's going to happen. And so often children develop what we call anticipatory anxiety. I want to be in situations where I feel in control of what's going to happen, where I know what's going to happen next. I know who'll be there. I know how loud it will be. I know how to find my way, and so on. So there are all sorts of different possible secondary behavioral outcomes of that reflex still being active. But the main feature of it tends to be hypersensitivity, hyperarousal, and hyperreactivity, which is so often a feature of autistic spectrum disorders.
Right. So that's where like preparing children that comes in as far as letting them know what's about to happen, or if something's going to be a loud noise or something like that.
Yes. Yes, it's understanding why your child has this need to know. It's
So what are some common signs that a child has retained primitive reflexes in everyday behavior?
I'm always a bit reluctant to give a sort of checklist of signs and symptoms because there can be so many different reasons. And also, those symptoms vary between individuals depending on what the profile of reflexes is in that child. So it's not that one reflex will cause X, Y, and Z, but if you have a little bit of A and a little bit of B and a little bit of C, then you may end up with a set of symptoms. So in terms of early development, it might be about 7 factors in the first 3 years of life related to differences in meeting various milestones. So things like perhaps early difficulties feeding, sucking, swallowing, sleeping, age at learning to walk, age at learning to talk. Did they go through the motor stages of crawling on their tummy like a commando, creeping on hands and knees? And as I say, one thing by itself doesn't mean anything. But if you start to get a cluster of factors, one after the other, then it's possible that we're seeing an early pattern of development that might have gone a tiny bit sideways. So then a little bit later on, by the time a child goes to school, it may be with issues with control of static balance, including sitting still, unusual sitting postures where they end up sort of lying on the writing surface, or they always need to wind their feet round the chair or sit on their feet, or they just can't sit still. Aspects of coordination, particularly hand-eye coordination, marked discrepancy between intelligence and performance at written tasks. That is usually interesting. It's not necessarily reflexes, but it's interesting. Reading difficulties in the absence of other causes. So there are so many reasons as to why a child might have reading difficulties. They might not have had opportunity for reading, practice of reading. There might have been a history of hearing problems. They might have difficulty matching auditory symbols to visual symbols, lots of different reasons. But if there are no obvious other causes, then it would be interesting if you particularly have a history of those sort of patterns of different development in the first 3 years of life, to have a look and see are reflexes a factor. And then a generalized hypersensitivity and hyperreactivity to things. Again, none of those in isolation, but if you have several of those together, that there always has to be a reason why somewhere.
Right. So then what evidence-based movement practices can help address the challenges, and what are some limitations parents should be aware of?
Well, I would say always look for what I call an evidence-based movement program. There are lots of movement programs around. Many of them are excellent, but some of them are more suitable for different age groups and for different types of problem. And some of them don't have a lot of research behind them to support that they do more than simply provide a fun activity, which is fine in itself, but it may not have a therapeutic impact. So all I can really talk about is the ones that we've done research on, where we took a modified form of our clinical program into schools. So instead of tailoring the physical movements to the reflex profile of the child, a whole class of children starts a developmental movement program at the beginning of the school year for 10 minutes a day under teacher supervision. They start with the earliest motor patterns and they replicate the first year of life in terms of motor development as a group over the course of the school year. So the exercises are gradually adjusted every few weeks, and they work their way through from what pretty much the state they're at birth to crawling, creeping, and standing. And what we have found is, before that intervention was even used, when they used a short screening test, that a significant percentage of children in mainstream schools in the UK had more than 25% signs of immature neuromotor skills. And we have always said that more than 25% is likely to be related to some degree of underachievement or underperformance in the classroom. And they found that this was true. The less mature the motor skills, the lower the educational performance, not necessarily ability, but performance. So they then used the same screening tests at the end of the intervention, and they found that the neurological status, so the immaturity, had improved significantly in the experimental groups compared to the control groups. In a smaller group where they had both immature motor skills and underachievement at the outset, those children showed greater progress, but the numbers were quite small, so it wasn't necessarily statistically significant. And the teachers in many schools, so we've done this with quite large samples, sort of 600 children in one sample, 600 in another, and then other small-scale studies. The teachers talk about the signs that they haven't necessarily measured, things like the draw a person test, which is one measure of non-verbal cognitive performance. Children's performance on that sometimes goes up 18 months to 2 years in a 9-month period. Things like their ability to maintain attention in the classes following the physical activity sessions. Playground behaviour, so that they're having less accidents at playtime, when moving between classes and so on, that just their physical awareness and control of their bodies is better. And that seems to have a secondary impact on behaviour and confidence. So our view is that it's worth doing these programs in school, because it's often easier to do them in school with a whole class of children than it is for parents who might do them 2 or 3 days a week, where other parents are doing them 7 days a week, and so on. But there are all sorts of different ways in which programs can be implemented, depending on the needs of the situation.
Right. And these exercise programs, I mean, they're across the board, that the children are all doing the same thing, or is it geared like that each child?
No, it's geared for the class, but I often say when I lecture abroad, other languages are able to describe what it takes me ages to say very succinctly. And I was in Germany a number of years ago, and I was trying to explain that the class doesn't move on until every child can do the exercises fluently. And she said, so basically you're saying in this situation, the slowest child leads the entire class. And I thought that was beautifully described.
So then how does the INPP school screening process work? And what key indicators should schools be looking for?
So what we've put together is this 15-minute screening test, which teachers can actually buy the test, but we recommend it's better to buy it and have a day's training in how to use it as well. I think they feel more confident that way, but it can be used without. So we've extrapolated from our clinical assessment protocol 2 general balance tests that will show whether children's balance is perfect or awful or somewhere in between. 3 reflexes, which have been consistently shown by researchers, not just ourselves, to be implicated in educational underperformance. And some very simple tests to pick up indications of problems with eye tracking and visual integration. So those tests can be administered, they take about 15 minutes per child. And we recommend that the school does that with a whole class of children before starting the program. Not all schools can do it because of time constraints, but ideally, that way teachers can identify which children in their class have issues related to neuromotor immaturity, and they can also evaluate at the end of the intervention, has it made a difference? Has it made a significant difference or not? So that's the sort of testing side of it. And then ideally they follow on with the movement program that I've just described. The whole class does. It's aimed chiefly at the children they've identified as having the most problems. But what teachers have said is that every child seems to gain benefit so that it's not wasted class time.
Oh, wow. So then what specific red flags should parents and educators watch for?
This is difficult always. And what I see, and I've seen it over and over again for years, and it just never seems to change, is the children and the families who the obvious questions have not been asked at the time that they should have been. And so these families have wasted 2 to 3 years without anything having been investigated. So things like obvious eye tracking problems or eyesight problems. If a child isn't reading and is struggling with writing, go and have the eyesight tested. It may come back perfectly normal, in which case the next question is it an oculomotor problem rather than an eyesight problem? Are they not hearing properly? So many aspects of behavior are related to hearing difficulties. In fact, not Paul Medall, Guy Bérard, all those years ago, wrote this wonderful book called Hearing Equals Behavior. It was a title I wish I had thought of, because he looks at how hearing problems create problems with attention, spatial awareness, mishearing, appearing not to pay attention, frustration. And we see again in old age a mirror of what can go wrong in early life, in that if you've ever walked along a busy street in a city behind an elderly person who's hard of hearing, they appear to be incredibly rude because they're totally unaware of anyone behind them or alongside them trying to get past, because we rely on hearing and balance to tell us what's behind ourselves, to tell us what's happening in front of ourselves. So if there is bilateral hearing impairment, that whole behind you sense is potentially affected. If you have it on one side, it then warps how you hear things, whether you're able to differentiate foreground from background noise, all sorts of issues really. So vision, hearing. If you have a child who seems to have tantrums for no reason that you can identify, perhaps look at dietary factors. Are there trigger foods, or is it to do with how much time has elapsed since they last ate? Because children who have these issues tend to be hungry in terms of burning up blood sugar quicker than other children, so they become depleted at an earlier stage. Then all the symptoms that come with dropping blood sugar tend to be behavioral. The importance of sleep in the modern age, which I think can be an issue for children, whether you have a child who won't sleep, which is one thing, or whether you have a child whose sleep is often disturbed, sometimes because perhaps they have a lot enlarged adenoids or tonsils, and therefore their sleep is disturbed because of the breathing being disturbed, whether it's because they're in an environment with background noise, whatever the reason, sleep is important. Any of the above and more, really.
Yeah. So how can parents effectively advocate for their child's needs within the school system regarding screening and early intervention?
I struggled with this one to come up with what I call clear answers. I think my general answer was don't give up and don't take no for an answer. You, as a parent, know your child better than anybody else. And if you know or you have a gut feeling that something isn't right, you are probably correct. So try to identify the issues that you're concerned with. Try to identify the trigger environments and trigger points for those concerns. And that may give you the first clues as to where referrals need to be made for further investigations. and also strategies that could be put in place to help within the classroom environment.
Right. Yeah, because it's better to investigate and have it amount to, there's no problem or no issue than to not question and let
Well,
time.
often it's a process of elimination. So it's not hearing, it's not vision, it's not food. So maybe it's balance, and that it often is, because there's often an interrelationship between these things. And to carry on until you find some sort of answer. It could be parenting, and you can't be parenting as well. But I think parents are too often blamed first, instead of looking at, is there something happening with this child that is making parenting more of a challenge for this child than for other siblings in the family?
How do reflex immaturity and sensory motor issues overlap with autism traits, and how can we address these?
I think probably the best thing is to give you some specific possible examples, one of which is to do with the eye's ability to converge and diverge. So over the years, I've seen many children who've had a diagnosis of the mild end of the autistic spectrum. And one of the criteria for that diagnosis has been lack of eye contact or poor eye contact. There have obviously been other factors in that mixture as well, but this is the sort of one that people tend to hone in on. And when I've started to assess the eye functioning, and I've done a simple test for visual convergence, so at this point here, they should go cross-eyed in theory, and they don't. This is a clue that there is going to be a difficulty, not only with focusing at different distances and ignoring background visual or foreground visual information, but also being able to adjust focus between different visual distances. Because, for example, when I'm looking at something at near distance here, my eyes are beginning to converge at that focal point. This is clear for me, but your screen in the background is now blurred because I have that near point convergent ability. If I then want to look at you, my eyes diverge, come out, and they come in again at the new focal point. And now you are clear, I can see this, but it's blurry. And that ability to converge, diverge between different distances allows us to ignore irrelevant background or foreground information to focus on what we want to look at. If you don't have that convergent ability and you're trying to look at somebody at this distance from you, they may look very nice and they may very much want you to look at them, but your eyes are continuously distracted by the background. And therefore, it's not that they won't make eye contact. It's in all probability that they can't. So often when that convergent ability improves, the eye contact also starts to improve. Now, they may still have other diagnostic signs on the autistic spectrum. One feature has improved, and alongside that, some of those social skills will start to improve as well, because not only are they able to look at the other person, but they are able to start reading that person's body language more effectively and to adjust to it. So that's just one tiny thing. Similarly, they can be what we call stimulus bound in one or several sensory systems. So in the visual system, that means that they are continuously distracted by peripheral visual information. They can't maintain central focus, and this is a constant distraction. That can be true in terms of auditory information as well. So they go into a classroom with a level of background noise, and however much they try to listen to the teacher, the background noise actually comes and goes as if it was competing with the teacher's voice. So those sort of things can be related. And then if you have underlying vestibular problems, it can affect the ability of the visual system to process visual information effectively, particularly if there's lots of visual stimuli around. You then get the hyperarousal, and then often the reaction to hyperarousal is to withdraw from something or to have a meltdown because you can't cope with it. So those are just a couple of examples, really, of how there can be a relationship.
And it explains so much, about not being able to make eye contact, and it just explains a lot about the why behind all of that.
Yes.
which is
And
important.
really, the why to me is the key to everything. Unless we understand why, we don't know what to do to help.
Right, yeah. So what are some at-home activities that parents can use to support their child's regulation and development?
I think, again, it's identifying those trigger environments and trigger points.
Mhm.
And then sitting down and analysing and saying, now, is it the situation, or is it something coming from inside the child that's reacting to that situation? Sometimes it's difficult to tell, but identifying the situation is the first thing. Remembering that sometimes a child's so-called, off-the-wall behaviour is an attempt to treat the problem themselves. And so instead of trying to change the behaviour, it's trying to understand why. So I think probably a story from many years ago helps to illustrate this, and forgive me if I've told you this one in a previous interview. A colleague of ours had a case where a child diagnosed as being on the spectrum, one of their autistic behaviours was to go into a room of people, take everybody's shoes off, put them in a circle, sit in the centre of the circle, and then start sniffing each pair of shoes. And if it was your pair that this child settled on, you should be very worried, because they picked the most pungent in the room to sit there and inhale like Chanel number 5. And Katerina, who was working with this child, realized that he was probably hyposensitive to smell and therefore was seeking out these strong smells, and this was his way of doing it. So she found a very strong smelling substance. She put layers of lint on his arm and then bandaged them and put this like drops on there. And for the first week, he went around attached to his arm, and each week the strength of the substance was diluted until there was virtually nothing there. And after 6 weeks, the arm bandage was removed and his so-called autistic behavior had stopped. So if she had simply tried to modify his behavior without understanding why he needed it, it wouldn't have worked. And sometimes it's difficult, and it's not always possible to find it, but that's a sort of example of understanding why. So another example would be perhaps a child who spins constantly, and this would be an indicator that they have hypoactive, underactive vestibular functioning. And they may well be making themselves feel better by this stimulation. But if they're continuing to need it, the type of vestibular stimulation they're providing for themselves is not the one the system needs to change and improve its function. And that's where the skill of perhaps an occupational therapist trained in sensory integration comes in, to look at this and say, okay, what planes of movement can we use? Do we need rapid stimulation? Do we need slow stimulation? Do we need a different plane of activity? And so on. So again, the key is trying to understand what and, if possible, why. And if it's not possible to do that, then it's a management thing, really, of, how can we make this situation less overstimulating for this child, or more stimulating according to what they need, and how can we adapt how we behave. And it's true of all behaviors. It's I think as parents, we live such busy, quite often stressful lives, that we forget that children need time to move from one mode of activity to another. And sometimes it's as simple as giving your child a 5-minute notice that you need them to change from one activity to another. Instead of going and saying, well, we're going out now, why aren't you ready? Well, I didn't know you wanted me to be ready. I haven't finished what I'm doing. But if you go in 5 minutes early and say, okay, I need you to stop that now, I need you to get your shoes on, and I need you to be downstairs in 5 minutes. What have you got to do? Make sure they've heard and remembered those 3 things. Sometimes that can make a big difference to whether your child does what you want, or whether you're screaming at them 5 minutes later because nobody is doing what anyone wanted. So sometimes they're just simple changes in that adult activity that can make a difference.
Right, right. So now I know you mentioned like spinning, like why is rhythm important for self-regulation in children?
Right, now somewhere here, because I had to think about this one, I made some notes, so bear with me a second. So, rhythm is about much more than listening to a drum beat or some music that makes you want to move. Rhythm is the language, the language through which we move and function through the world. And so we all have different rhythms, and we have different rhythms in different emotional states and so on. But somewhere we should be able to get to a rhythm that allows us to process, to function, and not to be overstressed. And so what we often find in dysregulated children is that their rhythm is all over the place. It's chaotic, it's randomized, and they have no sense of inner beat, for the want of a better word, or pulse. And so it's trying to find ways of getting that child into a rhythmic state that is more favorable. And I think the analogy that's useful is that one of my students years ago mentioned that her father had been quite a famous psychiatrist. And before he ever worked with a patient, and he was talking about adults, not children, he said, I work with a patient till I've walked with them. And I said, well, why? What was his reasoning? And she said, because in walking with someone, you have to follow their pace. And you get into the rhythm not only of their motion, but of their brainwave functioning as well. And when you have felt as they do, you are better able to communicate with them on other levels. So often that sort of simple thing of mirroring somebody's activity, feeling what it's like, and then seeing if you can actually help them to mirror yours when you're in a calm state, can help to adjust rhythm. But then there's all sorts of other things that we can do. So you can do activities. You know, there are specific activities that encourage the teaching of rhythm. So things like marching games. I mean, there's a reason why the military make the cadets march so much. Not only because it's discipline, but it makes a group of people work, move and work and think as one. You actually all literally marched to the beat of the same drum. The same happens in singing with choirs, that the brainwave function of singers starts to synchronize, sing as a group together. So marching, dancing, singing, specific action songs where you've got to clap along with it, you've got to do activities with the song. Rhymes, poems, and recitation. You know, a good old-fashioned nursery rhyme was wonderful for teaching rhythm. And then if you are wanting to induce specific states, then you can select particular types of music. So we know, for example, that classical Baroque music tends to be very organizing because it tends to be mathematical. And I was lucky enough to grow up in a household where my father was a professional classical musician. So, in fact, we weren't even allowed to listen to popular music when we were younger because he thought it was bad for our ears. But still now, all these years later, if I feel dysregulated, if I put on Bach, I have this feeling of, oh, I'm coming home. There's actually something very organizing about this. So obviously there is individual preference in what people need and what people like. But this is where music therapy can actually look at what a child's needs are and say, right, this is the beat we need, these are the frequencies we need. One method of sound therapy, the Johansson method, has a particular range of listening music CDs that are called hemiwaves that help try to synchronize the wave functioning in the two sides of the brain to bring people to a more relaxed and tranquil state. And then if we were looking at the top of the brain downwards, techniques like neurofeedback can also do similar things. So, you know, from the very basic earliest nursery rhymes to the more advanced technological techniques. There are lots of different ways of helping with that.
Now, earlier you spoke about, about posture. So, what does the phrase "can't sit still" reveal about child's readiness for sitting and sitting still in the classroom?
Well, the not sitting still is a signpost in itself, really, saying this child can only function while he or she is moving. So somewhere, the control of static balance and posture is not as well developed as it should be. So rather than insisting they sit still for longer and they stay in for longer after class for detentions because they haven't finished what they were doing, what they probably need is more regular movement breaks in the day, and also specific movement breaks that are looking at getting the upper and lower body to integrate better, because that's what's needed. In order to be able to sit still, we need the top and bottom half of the bodies to be able to sit on this point, irrespective of the head position. If there's a reflex that insists every time you put your head down, the lower half of your body wants to straighten and the upper half of your body wants to bend, you're going to end up lolling on the surface or wanting to anchor your feet round the chair or wriggle all the time. So I often say that posture is a language we can learn how to read. And in fact, it was a brilliant professor, Reuven Cohen-Ratz, all those years ago, who said that there is nothing in the mind that cannot be seen in the posture once you know how to read it. And I used to be quite sort of tickled when my students were in their first or second week of training with us, and we'd been doing work on reflexes and so on, and they'd go up into town for their lunch and come back after lunch, and they'd say, "Gosh, did you see so-and-so walking along the street? And then and that one." And I said, "I know, we should have business cards that we hand out," because they were learning to read that language. And once you've learnt it, you can't ignore it. It's there forever, really. So things like difficulties sitting still are most often in terms of reflexes linked to retention of something called a symmetrical tonic neck reflex or a spinal galant reflex, which if there is tactile stimulation of the lumbar region, the hip on one side wants to wiggle by itself, and therefore they don't have the truncal stability they need to support sitting posture.
So how can parents and teachers then implement movement-friendly strategies to support focus and engagement in the classroom?
I think it's being willing within the curriculum, constraints of the curriculum, to allow physical activity between classes as perhaps a regular part of the day, instead of assuming that children move seamlessly from one sitting class to another and they do this for 2 or 3 hours without a break. Is saying, okay, let's give you a chance before we start the next class. Let's have a movement break. Let's have not structured, but perhaps adult-led play sessions at break times, where instead of just free play, they're given the option, it shouldn't be compulsory, but of going and doing a range of physical activities, big movement activities that might help them concentrate for longer afterwards. I think it's this just general awareness within education that teaching alone is not enough. The body learns too.
Right. Now, one thing I wanted to touch upon, we were talking about the early years with children. Can you explain the importance of parents limiting their preschoolers' passive screen time?
I think if we look at it in 2 ways, one is the things that screen time does not do. It doesn't encourage children to engage in physical activity. It's a very sedentary, staring at a screen at a set visual distance, which is not actually reading distance, and neither is it the rest that the eyes need with far distance. So they are encouraging fixation at this sort of middle distance, which is not ideally designed for the distance children need to develop for learning to read. There is lots of rapid change of visual stimulus. So the visual system is having lots of changes of attention and movement, but these are not the same movements that the eyes need to develop to follow along a line of print to be able to read, whether it's in Latin languages from right to left or from other languages from left to right, and right to left. So it's not developing those range of eye movements. I think one of the most important hidden factors is that it doesn't listen to what the child has to say in return. It's pre-programmed. So it's non-adaptive in its response. It doesn't care. It's going to go on in its own program, irrespective of what the child does. I mean, it may be a game where they can get one thing to happen or not, but it's not conversational. And therefore, it doesn't develop that give and take, which is so important for social interaction and also for changing our thinking patterns. You know, often during a conversation, we'll think we're going to go in one direction, and then somebody says something else, and you find it goes somewhere completely different as a result. And those are the things which just don't happen in something that's been preset, and which, for however brilliant they are, and I know that designers of these games have fantastic minds, but they are a particular type of mind that thinks in a sort of what I call a digital binary way, rather than in that explorative, creative, trial and error way that is so important to develop other skills. It also tends to be addictive in terms of the neurotransmitter that is stimulated or released during these sessions, particularly dopamine, which is associated with the experience of reward, and is one of the reasons why children, once they're on those devices, find it very difficult to come off and change activity, because they tend to be addictive. So those are some of the things they don't do. They can overstimulate in terms of, you know, arousal and excitation without having a physical outlet. Whereas if you're charging around on a bicycle, you're in the playground, you're running around climbing trees, having play fights, you are getting rid of that excitation through your physical activity. And you're also practicing skills which every mammal needs. It is said that in the general mammalian kingdom, that if young mammals do not engage in rough and tumble play in their youth, they tend to be rejected by the pack when they grow up, because those are playing life skills that help not only develop catching and hunting and all the things that animals need to do, but also self-restraint. That an animal learns when there's somebody bigger than them, when they've done something that's annoyed somebody else in the pack, and you learn when to back off. And those are social skills. So they miss out on so many things, and it also tends to generate other things that are not so desirable. Now, it's not saying they're all bad. They're not. It's recognizing they have a time and a place. And generally speaking, the younger the child, the less time per day should be devoted to screen time. Preferably none, I would say, in the first 2 years of life.
And then our final question, are there activities that parents can do at home to support overall development?
Well, I think it's understanding why physical development is key to everything else. You know, so often as parents, we are anxious for our children to get to the next stage. Oh, he'll be crawling next week, or he'll be walking in a couple of months. And actually to embrace every one of those stages, because in that first year of life, in almost a telescopic form, every child recapitulates its own evolutionary history in terms of the movement patterns it goes through, from being like a fish-like creature movements in the womb to reptilian movements when lying on the floor, and then up on hands and knees like a mammal, and then simian when they're cruising on hands and knees, but still cruising on their feet, but still need to hold on to something. Each one of those stages is not only in reflecting how the brain is developing, but supporting the brain in developing, because all of those skills are the result of maturation, which is an internal process hardwired into the brain at birth, stimulated through experience and interaction. And that experience and interaction is how we learn. And the physical learning is the thing that's going to support every other form of learning. So once you understand that, be willing to provide that space and that opportunity to do it. And you can't go too wrong.
Mhm. Right. Mhm. Well, Sally, I just want to thank you so much for all this valuable information. And like you said, you need to understand, because if you don't understand the why behind everything, then it makes it really difficult to figure out any kind of a solution. And I'd like to thank all of you today for joining us. Just be sure to check out our sessions, check out the schedule coming up. And we have many more inspiring presentations and interviews with more experts and voices from across the spectrum. Thank you.
Thank you.